Karen squinted through the blinds, her gaze fixed on the driveway next door. Another one, she thought, a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. He was unloading bags from his trunk, large, opaque bags that crinkled ominously in the afternoon sun. The way he kept glancing around, as if checking for witnesses, sent a shiver down her spine. It reminded her of that night, the night the Thompsons' house was ransacked, the silver stolen, their sense of security shattered. Ever since, Karen had taken it upon herself to be the neighborhood's vigilant protector. Everyone else might be oblivious, lulled into a false sense of suburban peace, but Karen knew better. Danger lurked everywhere, disguised as ordinary people doing ordinary things. This new neighbor, with his shifty eyes and suspicious packages, he needed watching. She had a duty, a responsibility. Her fingers itched to dial 911, but she held back for now. She needed more evidence, concrete proof. She'd learned her lesson about jumping to conclusions, almost learned it. I've always considered myself a pretty average guy. I work a 9 to 5, I pay my taxes, and I generally try to keep to myself. My life is, for the most part, remarkably uneventful. That is, except for the fact that I live next door to Karen. Living next to Karen is like living under a permanent, high-powered magnifying glass. It's not that she's overtly hostile. It's more of a constant, low-level surveillance, a perpetual state of being scrutinized. Every time I step outside, I feel her eyes on me, analyzing, dissecting, judging. I'm pretty sure she has a direct line to the local police department, and I wouldn't be surprised if she had my license plate number memorized. This weekend, though, things are about to get interesting. It's Halloween, and I finally decided to go all out. I'd found the perfect costume, something truly terrifying. Something that, in hindsight, was probably a terrible idea to bring home in broad daylight when living next to the self-appointed sheriff of suburbia. The costume shop was a chaotic wonderland of fake blood, plastic limbs, and rubber masks. After browsing for what felt like hours, I finally found it. A hyper-realistic zombie getup. The clothes were ripped and stained with meticulously applied fake blood. The exposed flesh looked disturbingly real, and the mask, well, the mask was a masterpiece of grotesque artistry. It was the kind of thing that would make small children cry and send even the bravest adults running for the hills. Perfect. I posed for my gruesome purchase, feeling a childish glee bubble up inside me. I hadn't been this excited about Halloween in years. Back home, I parked in my usual spot, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn. I popped the trunk and carelessly tossed the shopping bags inside. There was no real hurry. The party wasn't until tomorrow night. I leaned against the car, pulling out my phone to answer a few texts. That's when I felt it. That familiar prickling sensation on the back of my neck. Karen. I glanced over, trying to appear nonchalant. She was standing on her porch, arms crossed, her head tilted at that judgmental angle she seemed to have perfected. Usually, I'd just ignore her. But today, something about her stare was different, more intense. It was like she was trying to solve a complex equation, and I was the unfortunate variable. Before I could even process what was happening, she spun around and darted back inside her house with the speed of a startled gazelle. Weird, I thought, shrugging it off. I had more important things to worry about, like figuring out the best way to apply the fake blood for maximum impact. As an afterthought, I reached into the trunk to rearrange the bags a bit, and I knocked over the small, folding camping knife I kept back there. I carefully picked it and set the knife on the bumper, just for a second to close the bag, forgetting all about the blade. From her kitchen window, Karen watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. The bags, The way he'd tossed them in, so casual, so guilty. And that look he'd given her. A fleeting glance, but it was enough. She saw the darkness, the hidden menace. She was sure of it. And then, the knife. A glint of silver in the fading sunlight. It all clicked into place. A horrifying, yet strangely exhilarating narrative unfolded in her mind. He wasn't just unloading groceries. He was disposing of evidence. She'd seen enough crime shows to know how this played out. The body was probably in those bags. Dismembered, most likely. She had to act fast. This wasn't just a suspicious package, this was a murder. Karen fumbled for her phone, her fingers trembling. 911. She had to call 911. This time she wouldn't hesitate. This time she had proof. 911, what's your emergency? A calm voice answered. I think my neighbor I think he murdered someone, Karen blurted out, her voice rising in pitch. Ma'am, I need you to calm down and tell me exactly what you saw, the operator said, her tone still even, but with a hint of urgency. He had these big bags, and a knife. He was putting them in his trunk. I think there's a body in there. Karen's breath came in ragged gasps, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and righteous indignation. I was humming along to a particularly catchy meme song, scrolling through my phone, when the first siren pierced the quiet suburban air. It started faintly, then grew louder, closer, until it was a deafening wail right outside my house. I looked up, my heart leaping into my throat. 3 police cruisers screeched to a halt in front of my driveway, their red and blue lights flashing a dizzying, terrifying pattern. Officers piled out, their faces grim, their hands hovering near their holsters. What the hell is going on? My mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos. Had there been an accident? A robbery? Was someone hurt? An officer approached me, his voice sharp and commanding. Sir, step away from the vehicle and put your hands where I can see them. My stomach dropped. This wasn't about an accident. This was about me. What's going on, officer? I stammered, my voice trembling. We received a report of a possible homicide. We need you to cooperate, sir, he replied, his eyes scanning me from head to toe. Homicide? Me? My brain short-circuited. This had to be a mistake. A really, really bad mistake. I slowly raised my hands, feeling the blood drain from my face. I could see Karen standing on her lawn, her arms crossed, a smug look of satisfaction on her face. It all clicked into place. Karen, of course. She'd seen the bags, the knife? Oh God, the knife. I'd forgotten all about it. It must still be on the bumper. Karen watched the scene unfold with a mixture of vindication and anxiety. This is it, she thought. I did the right thing. But a tiny voice in the back of her head whispered, "What if you're wrong?" She quickly squashed the doubt. She knew what she saw. Mr. Henderson, a retired accountant who lived across the street, shuffled over to Karen, his brow furrowed with concern. "Karen, what's all this commotion?" he asked, his voice raspy. "It's him," Karen said, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "He's a murderer. I saw him hiding the body." Mr. Henderson, who had always found Karen to be a bit intense, looked skeptical. "Now, Karen, are you sure? He seems like a nice enough young man." "Nice? He's a monster," Karen insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "I saw him with a knife, and those bags, they were heavy, Mr. Henderson, heavy." Mr. Henderson, however, noticed something Karen hadn't. He saw the forgotten camping knife. He also remembered that this young man mentioned his Halloween party. "Karen, sir, I need you to remain calm. We're going to open the trunk," the officer said, his voice firm but not unkind. I nodded, unable to speak. My throat felt like it was filled with cotton. I watched, paralyzed with fear and disbelief, as two officers cautiously approached the car. One of them slowly reached for the trunk release. This is it, I thought. My life is over. The trunk popped open. Silence. A long, agonizing silence. Then one of the officers let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. The other officer started to chuckle. I craned my neck, trying to see what was so amusing. Inside the trunk, nestled among the grocery bags, was my Halloween costume. The ripped, blood-stained clothes, the grotesque mask, the everything. It looked even more realistic, more horrifying, in the harsh glare of the police lights. The officer, holding the mask, turned it towards me, a slightly bewildered expression on his face. "Sir, is this yours?" he asked, struggling to maintain his composure. I nodded dumbly, the reality of the situation finally crashing down on me. I wasn't going to jail for murder. I was going to be the laughingstock of the entire neighborhood. And it was all thanks to Karen. "Ma'am," the lead officer said, turning to Karen, his voice laced with weary exasperation. "This is clearly a Halloween costume. There's no body, there's no evidence of any crime." Karen sputtered, her face turning a shade of red that rivaled the fake blood on my costume. But the knife. I saw him with a knife," she insisted, her voice shrill. "I saw it all." "The camping knife on your bumper, sir?" the officer asked me. "Oh, yes, I forgot that," I reply. The officer turned to Karen. "Ma'am, do you see a murder weapon? Do you see a body?" But nothing, ma'am. Do you know making a false police report is a crime?" I couldn't help but feel a surge of, well, I wouldn't call it joy, exactly, but something close to it. "Schadenfreude, maybe?" "Look," I said, finally finding my voice. "If I was going to commit a murder, do you really think I'd be stupid enough to leave the body in my trunk and then stand around checking my phone in plain sight?" The officer let out a sigh. The kind of sigh that only comes from years of dealing with situations like this. The officer turned back to Karen, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Ma'am, how many times have you called 911 in the past 6 months?" he asked, consulting his notepad. Karen paled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. 13, the officer said, answering his own question. 13 calls, suspicious vehicles, suspicious packages, suspicious squirrels. He listed several of the calls, each one more ridiculous than the last. One was about a teenager delivering Amazon packages. Another was a neighbor unloading bags of soil. A third was a golden retriever that Karen reported as a wild beast. Mr. Henderson, who had been quietly observing the scene, finally spoke up. "Karen," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I think you need to reevaluate things. This young man hasn't done anything wrong." Other neighbors, drawn by the commotion, had gathered around, murmuring amongst themselves. The whispers were getting louder. "She's always been like this. Remember that time she called the cops on the kids for playing hopscotch? I knew she was eccentric, but this is—" Karen looked around, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The fear in her eyes was replaced by a dawning realization. She was alone. Her reign of terror was over. "These were legitimate concerns," Karen protested weakly, but her voice cracked. The policeman ignored her. "Well, ma'am, based on these repeated false reports, we have enough grounds to constitute misuse of emergency services and disturbance of public order." Karen went white as a sheet. But I was just trying to help," she stammered. "Then help by not calling us," the officer retorted, snapping his notebook shut. The police eventually left after issuing Karen a stern warning and taking down a detailed report. The crowd of neighbors slowly dispersed, shaking their heads and whispering. I was left standing there, feeling a strange mixture of relief, embarrassment, and amusement. It was also utterly absurd. The whole thing was a testament of Karen's imagination. The following week, a notice appeared on everyone's doorstep, announcing a mandatory neighborhood meeting. I knew, without a doubt, what the topic of discussion would be. The meeting was held in the community center, a drab, beige room that usually hosted bingo nights and potlucks. Tonight, however, it was the setting for a different kind of drama. The room was packed, every seat filled, with people standing along the walls. Karen was there, sitting in the front row, her head bowed, avoiding eye contact. The meeting started with a recap of the incident, as it was now being called. The head of the neighborhood association, a stern-looking woman named Mrs. Davis, laid out the facts, her voice echoing through the room. Then she opened the floor for discussion. One by one, people stood up and shared their stories about Karen. The complaints ranged from minor annoyances, her constant complaints about lawn ornaments, to more serious accusations, her harassment of a family who had recently moved in from out of state. The stories piled up, each one a nail in the coffin of Karen's reputation. She sat there, frozen, feeling the weight of everyone's judgment. Some people wanted her evicted. Others suggested mandatory counseling. A few, surprisingly, spoke up in her defense, suggesting that she needed help, not punishment. The discussion went on for over an hour, a messy, emotional outpouring of years of pent-up frustration. Karen, for the first time, remained silent. She didn't try to defend herself. She didn't offer any excuses. She just sat there, absorbing the collective anger of the community she had tried, in her own misguided way, to protect. Whether she was truly remorseful or simply defeated remained unclear. The meeting adjourned without a definitive resolution, leaving Karen's fate hanging in the balance. I'd be lying if I said I didn't consider some form of petty revenge. The thought of placing a life-sized, motion-activated zombie on her porch did cross my mind. Or maybe just leaving a single plastic, blood-stained hand in her mailbox. But in the end, I decided against it. It wouldn't solve anything. It would just perpetuate the cycle of absurdity. Still, I couldn't resist a small gesture. On Halloween night, I placed a single, perfectly realistic rubber rat near her front step. Just a little something to remind her, and maybe give her a good scare. It wasn't exactly mature, but it felt satisfying. The days following the great Halloween costume debacle, as I'd privately dubbed it, were interesting. A strange mix of emotions washed over me. There was the lingering embarrassment, of course, the residual awkwardness of being that guy who caused a 3-car police response over a Halloween costume. There was also a sense of vindication, a quiet satisfaction that Karen had finally been exposed for the neighborhood menace she was. But beneath it all, there was a twinge of something else. Pity? Maybe. Or perhaps just a realization that Karen, for all her flaws, was a deeply lonely and frightened person. The rubber rat had felt good in the moment, a harmless prank. But now, I wasn't so sure. Had I stooped to her level? Maybe, maybe not. Life next to Karen was certainly never dull. I found myself reflecting, how did I end up in this absurd situation? Karen, for her part, became a ghost of her former self. She rarely left her house, and when she did, she avoided eye contact. The curtains were always drawn, the blinds perpetually shut. Whether this was a sign of genuine remorse or simply a strategic retreat was anyone's guess. Some neighbors claimed to have seen her tending her garden in the dead of night, as if trying to avoid any human interaction. Others whispered that she was planning to move, to escape the shame and the judgment. The truth, as always with Karen, was probably somewhere in between. She hadn't apologized, not directly, but her silence spoke volumes. Perhaps the silence, she'd learned, spoke with a louder volume than any 911 call. The whole ordeal, as ridiculous as it was, left me thinking. It made me think about the importance of community, of real, genuine connection, not the superficial surveillance that Karen had practiced. It made me think about the dangers of fear, how it can warp our perceptions and turn us against each other. It highlighted, starkly, the difference between looking out for your neighbors and looking at them. The line, seemingly thin, was in reality a vast chasm, and it also reminded me rather forcefully that jumping to conclusions is rarely a good idea. Sometimes a zombie costume is just a zombie costume. And sometimes the most terrifying thing in a neighborhood isn't a hidden threat, but the fear itself. The fear that festers and spreads, turning ordinary people into something other, something less than human, something like Karen. If you found yourself chuckling, or maybe even cringing in recognition, at this whole suburban saga, do me a favor. Hit that like button, share this story with your friends, especially if you have a Karen in your life, and definitely subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it keeps these stories coming. Thanks for sticking around, and remember, be careful what you put in your trunk.